The silence in the House Oversight Committee chamber was deafening when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett removed her glasses and leaned into the microphone. What she was about to say would shatter the carefully constructed walls of one of America's most powerful families. And she knew it. The sealed envelope in her hand contained documents that had been buried for years, protected by legal machinery and political influence that ran deeper than most Americans could imagine. Barron Trump might not actually be Donald Trump's biological son, and the evidence was about to spill across every television screen in America. The hearing on presidential overreach had already dragged on for over an hour, with most viewers tuning out the usual political theater. Committee members shuffled their papers, some checking their phones, others staring at the ceiling with the practiced boredom of career politicians. But when Jasmine Crockett straightened her shoulders and asked for complete silence, something shifted in the room. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. Her voice did not rise to command attention. Instead, it dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have managed. Every person in that chamber, from the youngest intern to the most seasoned representative, found themselves leaning forward without realizing it. I want to shift this discussion to something that speaks directly to the character of leadership in this country, she began, her eyes scanning the faces of her colleagues with the steady gaze of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. We have spent years in this chamber protecting power over truth, and that practice ends today. Chairperson Reuben Geller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming against the mahogany table. He had been briefed on the general topics for today's hearing, but this was not on any agenda he had seen. Several committee members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. Jasmine Crockett was known for her thorough preparation and her unwillingness to back down from difficult topics, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. There exists a set of sealed documents originating from an Arizona family court in 2019. She continued, her voice maintaining that same measured tone that made every word feel like a hammer strike. These documents were sealed not through standard legal procedure, but through political influence and legal maneuvering, designed to protect a sitting president from embarrassing revelations about his personal life. The room was no longer just quiet. It was holding its breath. Matt Overby, a senior committee member known for his interruptions and parliamentary procedure objections, opened his mouth to speak but found himself frozen. Something about the way Jasmine Crockett was presenting this information told him that any interruption would only make the revelation more dramatic. She had clearly planned this moment down to the second. I have in my possession a sworn affidavit from a federal contractor who handled the digital destruction of sensitive files under the White House Correspondence Protection Act, she said, lifting a manila folder from her desk. One file was different from the others. It referenced a payment of $3.1 million to a woman identified only by the initials TB. The only phrase that was not redacted from this financial record was particularly telling. She paused, allowing the weight of that number to sink in. $3.1 million. That was not hush money for a simple affair. That was the kind of money that bought permanent silence about something that could end careers and destroy legacies. Jasmine Crockett opened the folder and removed a photocopy of a document. The cameras in the room automatically zoomed in, and viewers across America suddenly found themselves staring at a piece of paper that would change everything they thought they knew about their former president. Paternity agreement enforced under non-disclosure. DNA confirmation pending approval, she read aloud, her voice never wavering. This document, signed and notarized in Arizona, suggests that then-President Trump was aware that Barron Trump was not his biological child and used the full power of his office to suppress this information. The explosion of noise that followed was unlike anything that chamber had ever experienced. Reporters began shouting questions. Committee members slammed their hands on tables. The usually composed C-SPAN cameras began shaking as camera operators struggled to capture the chaos. But through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the folder in front of her. Matt Overby finally found his voice, standing up so quickly that his chair rolled backward. Is this really the appropriate time and place for these kinds of personal accusations? he demanded, his face flushed with a combination of anger and panic. Jasmine Crockett turned her gaze to him, and for a moment the room fell silent again. The people of this country did not elect us to protect the comfortable lies of powerful men, she said, her voice carrying a steel edge that cut through the chaos. They elected us to represent their interests, and their interests include knowing when their leaders have used government resources to hide fundamental truths about their character. She stood up, still holding the folder, and faced the cameras directly. If the President of the United States knew during his first term that Barron Trump was not biologically his son, and if he used the mechanisms of government to bury that information to protect his political image, then we have a crisis that extends far beyond personal scandal. We have a systematic abuse of power that strikes at the heart of democratic accountability. The room erupted again, but this time the noise was different. It was not just surprise or outrage. It was the sound of a story that everyone knew would dominate headlines for weeks, maybe months. Phone screens across America began lighting up with notifications. Social media platforms crashed under the sudden surge of traffic. News producers began frantically rewriting their evening broadcasts. CNN interrupted its regular programming within minutes. MSNBC followed immediately. Even Fox News, after a brief internal debate that viewers could practically feel through their television screens, decided that the story was too big to ignore. By the time Jasmine Crockett had finished her statement, her words were being broadcast to every corner of the country. Eleanor Vance, a committee member known for her attempts to maintain decorum even in the most heated political moments, tried to regain control of the situation. Perhaps we should consider the impact of these allegations on the child involved, she said, her voice strained with the effort of remaining diplomatic. Barron Trump is still a minor, and bringing him into this kind of public scrutiny seems inappropriate. Jasmine Crockett's response was swift and devastating. You want to protect a child and stop allowing him to be used as a prop in a political performance built on lies? The protection of children begins with the protection of truth, and truth is exactly what has been systematically destroyed in this case. The microphones throughout the chamber went hot as representatives began shouting over each other. The carefully controlled atmosphere of congressional proceedings dissolved into something that looked more like a town hall meeting in a particularly heated election year. But before anyone could restore order, the House feed cut unexpectedly. For 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Americans stared at blank screens or technical difficulty messages. During those precious minutes, frantic phone calls were made between network executives, White House communications staff, and congressional leadership. When the feed finally returned, Jasmine Crockett was no longer at the podium, and the hearing had been suspended indefinitely, but it was already too late. The damage had been done, and the story was spreading faster than any attempt to contain it could possibly manage. Within hours, news organizations were scrambling to verify the details of Jasmine Crockett's claims. Investigative reporters who had been covering Trump for years began pulling old files and making phone calls to sources they had not contacted in months. Legal experts appeared on television to explain the implications of sealed court documents and the process of challenging their confidentiality. The woman behind the initials TB was identified within 24 hours, though her full name was not immediately released to the public. Genevieve Larson, a 51-year-old nurse living in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles, found herself at the center of a media storm that she had spent years trying to avoid. Her neighbors began reporting strange cars parked on their street. Her phone began ringing constantly with calls from numbers she did not recognize. Notes were slipped under her door from reporters offering substantial sums of money for exclusive interviews. The quiet life she had built for herself and her son was disintegrating in real time. But Genevieve Larson was not the only person whose life changed that day. In the West Wing of the White House, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. President Donald Trump had been in a meeting with agricultural advisors when his chief of staff, Brian Halford, burst into the room with his phone in his hand and panic written across his face. The advisors were quickly dismissed, and Trump found himself staring at a television screen that showed Jasmine Crockett's face alongside graphics that read, explosive allegations, and sealed documents. The initial reaction was predictable. Trump demanded that someone call the networks immediately. He wanted to know who had authorized the broadcast of what he called completely fabricated lies. He wanted lawsuits filed against every media outlet that had covered the story. He wanted Jasmine Crockett investigated for ethics violations and possible criminal charges, but as the hours passed and more details emerged, the tone in the White House began to shift. Legal advisors who had been brought in to discuss defamation. Lawsuits began asking uncomfortable questions about the sealed documents. Communications staff, who had been preparing aggressive denial statements, began requesting more information about the specific claims being made. Hope Sinclair, Trump's personal legal counsel, was the first to voice what everyone in the room was thinking: if these documents exist, and if they contain what Congresswoman Crockett claims they contain, then we cannot simply dismiss this as a political attack. We need to know exactly what we are dealing with. The conversation that followed was unlike any that had taken place in the Trump White House. For the first time since the administration had begun, the president was being asked directly about something that he could not simply deny or dismiss. The sealed documents were real. The court case was real. The woman identified as TB was real. The only question was whether the contents of those documents were what Jasmine Crockett claimed they were. Trump's silence in response to those questions told his advisors everything they needed to know. Meanwhile, in living rooms and coffee shops across America, ordinary citizens were grappling with the implications of what they had witnessed. The story was not just about politics or scandal. It was about the fundamental question of whether the American people had the right to know the truth about their leaders, even when that truth was uncomfortable or embarrassing. In a diner in Iowa, a conversation between a retired farmer and a young teacher captured the mood of much of the country. The farmer, a lifelong Republican, found himself defending the principle of transparency over party loyalty. The teacher, who had never been particularly interested in politics, was asking questions about the legal system and how sealed documents could be used to hide information from the public. Similar conversations were taking place everywhere: in barbershops and beauty salons, in university lecture halls and factory break rooms. Americans were discussing not just the specific allegations against Trump, but the broader question of what they expected from their political leaders. The impact on social media was immediate and overwhelming. Hashtags related to the story began trending within hours. Video clips of Jasmine Crockett's statement were shared millions of times. Memes and commentary flooded every platform. But unlike many political scandals that quickly devolved into partisan mudslinging, this story seemed to transcend traditional political divisions. Conservative commentators found themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending the indefensible. Liberal commentators struggled to avoid appearing to celebrate what was ultimately a story about a child whose parentage had become a matter of public debate. Many chose to focus on the broader questions of accountability and transparency rather than the specific personal details of the allegation. Jasmine Crockett herself remained largely silent in the immediate aftermath of her statement. She did not give interviews or hold press conferences. She did not appear on television talk shows or write op-eds explaining her actions. Instead, she returned to her office and continued with her regular congressional duties, leaving the rest of the world to process what she had revealed. But her silence was not inaction. Behind the scenes, her legal team was working with court officials in Arizona to determine whether the sealed documents could be made public. Her staff was fielding calls from journalists, legal experts, and fellow members of Congress who wanted to understand the full scope of what she had uncovered. The sealed documents themselves became the focal point of a legal battle that would ultimately determine not just the fate of Trump's political career, but the precedent for how similar cases would be handled in the future. Legal experts argued that the public interest in transparency outweighed the privacy concerns that had originally justified sealing the documents. Trump's legal team argued that releasing the documents would constitute a violation of attorney-client privilege and could set a dangerous precedent for the exposure of private family matters. The battle over the documents played out in courtrooms. and on television screens simultaneously. Every legal filing was immediately analyzed by teams of experts. Every court hearing was broadcast live. Americans found themselves receiving an education in family law, privacy rights, and the limits of executive privilege. As the legal proceedings continued, more details about the original case began to emerge. Court records that had not been sealed revealed that Genevieve Larson had initially sought to establish paternity through the normal legal channels. She had requested DNA testing and asked for child support payments that would have been appropriate for someone of Trump's financial means. The records also showed that Trump's legal team had fought the paternity case not by denying the allegations, but by arguing that the case should be dismissed on the grounds that it would interfere with his duties as president. They had successfully argued that the case should be sealed to protect national security interests, a claim that legal experts now described as highly questionable. The financial records that Jasmine Crockett had referenced painted a picture of a systematic effort to make the case disappear. The $3.1 million payment to Genevieve Larson had been structured as a series of smaller payments made through a complex network of shell companies and legal firms, been accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement that prevented Larson from discussing the case publicly, but the most damaging revelation was yet to come. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that the effort to suppress the paternity lawsuit had involved not just Trump's personal legal team, but also government resources. Justice Department lawyers had been consulted about the case. White House staff had been involved in crafting the legal strategy. Federal judges had been contacted. It's about the appropriateness of sealing the case, the use of government resources to handle what was essentially a private legal matter represented a clear abuse of power. Even Republicans who had been reluctant to criticize Trump found themselves unable to defend the mixing of personal and official business. The political implications were immediate and severe. Trump's approval ratings, which had remained surprisingly stable throughout various scandals and controversies, began to plummet. Republican candidates distanced themselves from the former president. Donors who had been reliable supporters began to withdraw their backing. But the impact extended beyond Trump himself. The case raised fundamental questions about the accountability of elected officials and the lengths to which they could go to protect their personal reputations. It sparked a national conversation about the relationship between private conduct and public service. Legal scholars began calling for reforms to the system of sealed court documents, arguing that the current system was too easily manipulated by wealthy and powerful individuals. Ethics experts called for stricter rules about the use of government resources for personal legal matters. Campaign finance reformers pointed to the case as an example of how money could be used to suppress information that voters needed to make informed decisions. As the story continued to develop, Jasmine Crockett found herself in an unusual position. She had become a household name virtually overnight, but she had done so by exposing uncomfortable truths rather than by promoting herself. She received praise from transparency advocates and criticism from those who believed she had violated norms of privacy and discretion. Her response to both the praise and the criticism was characteristically direct. In a brief statement released through her office, she wrote, "I was elected to represent the interests of my constituents, and their interests include having leaders who are honest about their use of power. I will continue to fulfill that responsibility regardless of the personal or political consequences." The statement was typical of Jasmine Crockett's approach throughout the entire controversy. She had not sought to become the center of a national scandal. She had simply done what she believed was necessary to ensure that the American people had access to information that was relevant to their evaluation of their leaders. But as the legal and political battles continued, it became clear that the case would have implications far beyond the specific allegations against Trump. The precedent set by the court's handling of the sealed documents would influence how similar cases were handled in the future. The political response to the allegations would help determine the standards that Americans expected from their elected officials. The woman at the center of the controversy, Genevieve Larson, eventually broke her silence with a carefully crafted statement that was both dignified and devastating. Speaking through her attorney, she confirmed the essential details of Jasmine Crockett's allegations, while emphasizing that she had never sought to make her personal situation a matter of public debate. I entered into the legal proceedings in Arizona because I believed that my son deserved to know the truth about his parentage and to receive the support that he was entitled to, she said. I accepted the financial settlement and agreed to the non-disclosure agreement because I was told that it would protect my son from public scrutiny. I now realize that the agreement was designed not to protect my son, but to protect a political career built on deception. Her statement included details about the pressure she had faced to remain silent, and the threats she had received when she had initially sought to establish paternity through the courts. She described a legal system that had been manipulated by wealth and political influence to suppress information that the public had a right to know. The impact of her statement was immediate and profound. It transformed the narrative from one of political scandal to one of systematic abuse of power. It highlighted the ways in which the legal system could be used to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It demonstrated the courage required to speak truth to power, even when that truth was uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. As the case moved through the courts and the political ramifications continued to unfold, Americans found themselves confronting fundamental questions about the nature of democracy and accountability. The story that had begun with Jasmine Crockett's carefully prepared statement in a congressional hearing had become a national referendum on the standards of conduct expected from elected officials. The sealed documents were eventually released after a federal judge ruled that the public interest in transparency outweighed the privacy concerns that had originally justified their suppression. The contents of the documents confirmed every detail of Jasmine Crockett's allegations and revealed additional information about the extent of the efforts to suppress the case. The political career of Donald Trump, which had survived numerous scandals and controversies, could not survive the revelation that he had used the power of his office to hide the truth about his family while presenting himself as a champion of traditional values. The hypocrisy was too blatant, the abuse of power too clear, and the cover-up too extensive for even his most loyal supporters to defend. But perhaps the most significant impact of the case was not on Trump himself, but on the political system as a whole. The case had demonstrated that even the most powerful individuals could be held accountable for their actions if brave people were willing to risk their careers and reputations to expose the truth. Jasmine Crockett had not set out to end a political career or to become a national figure. She had simply done what she believed was necessary to ensure that the American people had access to information that was relevant to their evaluation of their leaders. In doing so, she had reminded the country that democracy depends not on the protection of comfortable lies, but on the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. The story that had begun with a few carefully chosen words in a congressional hearing had become a testament to the power of truth and the importance of accountability in democratic society. It had shown that even the most carefully constructed facades could crumble when confronted with documented evidence and moral courage. As the dust settled and the immediate political ramifications played out, the case continued to influence American politics in ways both subtle and profound. It established new precedents for the handling of sealed court documents involving public figures, raised the bar for ethical conduct by elected officials. It demonstrated the importance of investigative journalism and congressional oversight in holding powerful individuals accountable. Most importantly, it reminded Americans that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation by citizens who are willing to demand honesty and accountability from their leaders. It requires elected officials who are willing to risk their political careers to expose wrongdoing. It requires a legal system that serves justice rather than protecting the powerful. The story of Jasmine Crockett and the sealed documents had become more than just a political scandal. It had become a defining moment in American democracy, a reminder that the truth, however uncomfortable, is the foundation upon which a free society must be built. And in a world where truth is often treated as a commodity to be bought and sold, that reminder was more valuable than any political victory or personal advancement. The courage to speak truth to power, demonstrated so clearly by Jasmine Crockett in that congressional hearing room, had reminded America of its highest ideals and its most fundamental values. It had shown that even in the darkest moments of political cynicism and moral compromise, there are still people willing to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. That, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all.